This story took place when I was 23 years old, close to 10 years ago. I was living in upstate New York in a very rural area with my ex-boyfriend and his family. He and I used to argue quite a bit. One morning, before he went to work, he and I got into a very heated argument. He was 20 years my senior, but during this particular fight he acted majorly juvenile. He jumped out of bed, flipped me the bird, and yelled, "If you don't like it so much, then why don't you go back to the fucking Bronx?" That was all the prompting I needed. I threw on my Uggs and my winter jacket, grabbed my cigarettes, and flew right out of the house. I'm unfortunately an impulsive ass, and didn't think to grab my cell phone before I stormed out. I didn't drive, so my only option was to walk. I don't think at the time that I intended to walk all the way back to the Bronx, as I was a 3-hour car ride upstate. I just needed to go on an angry, dramatic walk to let off some steam. I realized once I got to this road at the entrance of the trailer park that I had no idea where anything really was around me. I'd only lived there for a few months at that point, and we didn't really exactly go out a lot. I banked left and just walked and walked, where I knew civilization was. I found myself walking alongside a very busy stretch of road, with 18-wheelers flying by, spraying me with slushy snow and soaking my shoes. I saw my then-boyfriend driving by on his way to work. He sped up as he drove past me, evidently still very angry about our fight. I thought for sure he was going to turn around at some point, but he never came back. I pressed on, deciding instead to try and walk to my best friend's mother's house, which I knew to be in the same town. It started to snow pretty soon, though, and I was losing momentum. I passed by a VFW, where a nondescript pickup truck was parked in the driveway. It wasn't until I passed it that I even realized the driver was in the front seat. He called out to me, "Hey, honey, do you need help?" My stomach churned, realizing I would have to accept this stranger's offer. I approached his truck slowly and tried to weigh out my options. He was a clean-cut, seemingly normal older white guy. Gray hair, greenish-blue eyes, very average. I don't know why, but I blurted out, "Are you a good guy or a bad guy?" I cringed at myself for asking such a dumb question. "I'm a good guy. I wouldn't tell you if I was a bad guy." I ignored the bells going off in my head and hopped in the front seat with him. As we drove, I realized I had no clue where my friend's mom actually lived. I knew the name of the road she lived on, but it spanned a good distance, so it wasn't very helpful in terms of finding my destination. I asked to borrow his cell phone so I could try calling my best friend to ask her where the fuck I was going. I called her 3 times, and she didn't answer because she didn't recognize the number. I started to feel inexplicably hopeless. After a few minutes, he asked me where I was from, and why I was out in the middle of nowhere in the snow wearing only pajamas. I explained I was originally from the Bronx, and that I had gotten into a fight with my boyfriend. He paused for a moment and said, "Hey, you wouldn't be interested in making a little money, would you?" I chuckled nervously. "Oh, no thanks, though." "Well, I just figured, since you said you were from the Bronx," and trailed off. Realizing at that point that I was almost definitely in some deep shit, I muttered, "Oh, sure. He eyed me up and down and laughed to himself before sneering. I started to panic big time, but I knew I couldn't show my fear. I scoured the scenery for a pillowy snowbank that I could land in if I left out of the truck, but to no avail. The houses were so few and far in between. I became certain this would be how I met my demise. I'll never know why, but it was at this point that he decided to ask me who I was going to see. I quickly blurted out my best friend's mom's name and her husband's full name. He instantly perked up and explained that he knew the husband They used to snowmobile together 20 years ago. I felt the greatest wave of relief when he explained that he knew exactly where his old buddy lived. When we finally pulled up to that big yellow house, it was like arriving to the promised land. I sheepishly asked his name. Steve, he said. He then asked mine. I gave him a fake name, spat out a bullshit thank you, and ran as fast as I could from his truck to the porch. I crashed through the front door and locked it behind me. I immediately started crying and running through the house, trying to find my friend's mom. I had awoken her from a sound sleep, but she didn't say a word upon seeing how shaken up I was. Once I knew I was safe with her, I explained everything. The fight, the fleeing, the weird guy and his sexual proposition. She listened, horrified and curious at the same time. She made me promise to never do anything so reckless again, and that if I needed her, to just call her. She told me she would ask her husband when he got home about this Steve guy, and find out more about him. I returned to my boyfriend's later that same day, and got really stoned to try and forget about the events of that morning. The following day, my friend's mom called me to tell me that Steve was a very dangerous person who her husband had cut off communication with years ago. The last he had heard about Steve was that he had been arrested for sexual assault. She then went on to point out how easy it would have been for him to hurt me and leave me just about anywhere on some lonely stretch of road. No one would even know where to look for me, not to mention I might not have even been found until the snow thawed out. Upon sharing this post with the best friend of mine mentioned in the story, she reminded me that I left out a super unsettling detail. When her mom called, she was able to tell me Steve's last name. One of the first results on Google with his name, plus the town's name, brought me straight to a registered sex offender website with a mugshot of him. His eyes looked cold and empty, and I realized that with him being on probation at the time, he would have been especially eager to not have me get him in any further trouble with the law. Her mom said it best when she told me that I must have some serious guardian angels looking out for me. Sorry about the length, but this happened ritualistically and periodically throughout my whole life. It all started when I was probably about the age of 9 in the summertime. My brother was a year younger than me, and long story short, he convinced me to go look for some cats that he had seen. I put my shoes on and followed my little brother out the door. We walked the streets in search of bastard kittens, completely unsupervised. I lived in a small town, and my mom worked at Pizza King until 9 p.m. every weekday. My dad worked until midnight at Johnson Controls. That left our older sister, 13 at the time, to supervise us, but she was always off doing God knows what. Because of these circumstances, I realized later that we were perfect targets. Predictable schedules, lack of supervision, and comfortable in our tight-knit Midwestern neighborhood. My brother led me about 6 blocks away when someone called out to us. I turned my head to find 4 young men leaning up against an old gray 2-door beater. They were standing outside of a known drug house. They were smoking cigarettes and seemingly minding their own business. The one who called out to us, closest to the passenger seat, asked us, "Do you guys want some gum?" I stopped dead in my tracks, and my brother looked confused. They offered us gum? It was eerily reminiscent of our yearly stranger danger assemblies in the school auditorium. My brother and I looked at them for a moment, but then turned around and started walking back the way we came, saying nothing. They yelled at us to stop, and we turned our heads and saw the driver getting into his car quickly, the passenger pulling the seat up to let the other 2 in the back. As the engine started up, we both ran. We ran through the yard of a man whose lawn was always way overgrown. We tried to crouch low to the ground and lose them, but the loud engine of that old beater was getting closer. It didn't occur to me that they could see the grass moving as we crawled through. I got up this time and ran at full speed, weaving in and out of people's yards to try and buy us some time. They followed us the whole way. When I realized there was no outrunning a car, we took a straight line to one of our neighbors' houses and started beating on their back door. The car sped out from around the corner and stopped abruptly in the driveway. We abandoned that idea and hopped over her fence. We eventually made it back to our house and thought we'd lost them. My mom's voice startled me from behind. "Where have you been? Where's your sister?" I think she had come home because she was on a delivery route that day. Sometimes when someone messed up a pizza, the owners would let my mom take it home to us if she was on delivery, so that we had something to eat when the pantry was empty. I started to tell my mom what happened. She didn't look like she was too keen on buying my story at first, until I stopped mid-sentence at the sound of a sputtering engine. I looked outside. The 4 men drove past our house slowly, looking into our windows and making eye contact, giving us a menacing look. My mom saw the men and tried to close the blinds. The track was broken, but failed. She told us to stay inside for the rest of the day. She left after that. I can't explain why, so don't ask. She just did. Later that night, still no sign of our sister anywhere, and we were hungry. We made some mac and cheese and put on Hannah Montana to get our minds off things. Laughing at scenes that weren't even funny, my nerves started to settle a bit. However, I kept on seeing this tiny red light in the corner of my eyes, coming from the window. I kept brushing it off. It could have been anything. After some time, I finally stood up and went over to the window to investigate. I saw that this red dot was actually the light of a video camera. I gasped at the sight of this, and the man holding it ran away immediately, towards another man illuminated by a street light down the road. Naturally, I panicked and cried. I ran outside and screamed my sister's name as loud as I could. I ran back inside. I called 911 first, then my mom. I told them that there were 2 men with what I thought was a video camera outside on the street. The police showed up after circling the area, said they'd stake out for a couple of hours at the house on the corner, but that the man would probably be long gone. They never did find the man, but the man found us, over and over again. A couple of years later, my brother had the neighbor's kid over for a sleepover. We all hung out in his room until late at night, laughing loudly and shooting BB guns at the ceiling and each other. I left the room, and when I came back, my brother had told me that a hand had slapped the window and slid down, just like in a horror film. I thought he was just trying to scare me, and I still believe he was probably lying. I was just in the middle of telling him how full of shit he was when I saw that little red dot again out of the corner of my eye, silencing all of us. We ducked to the floor at first, silent, unbreathing. Then my brother crawled over and turned off the light. We stayed there for a long time until waking our parents up, but they found nothing. I passed it off as a prank. Another couple of years later, in an insomniac-induced all-nighter, I was sitting in our sunroom, with big windows all around and no curtains, reading a book. It was about 3 o'clock in the morning, and the whole house was asleep. I had my headphones in, listening to my MP3 player, when I thought I heard a loud noise over the music. I looked up, startled, and I saw a man at the door watching me at 3 in the morning. This was the closest I had ever been to him. I froze and stared at him. He was about 6 feet tall. His hair was long and wavy over his eyebrows. It almost looked kind of like bangs or a comb-over without enough gel. He was wearing a white hoodie and long blue pants that nearly covered his shoes. He looked like an aged-up version of the man who had offered us a piece of gum years before. He had a blue digital camera in his hand, down to his side. He walked away casually, without fear or haste, maintaining eye contact the whole time. I followed him with my eyes, past the windows, and behind the only window that was concealed with blinds out of my sight. I ran inside and told no one. I passed it off as a sleep-deprived hallucination for months, denying the nightmares and cold chills. I finally came to the realization. This was the man I had seen years before, and I remembered something. That door's lock was broken. Those weren't the only times we caught someone outside our windows. It happened for years, and it almost became an odd fact of life. He seemed to be less interested the older I grew, though. It's strange because he always purposely reveals his presence to me instead of trying to stay discreet. He even showed his face to me that one night. It makes me wonder what kinds of pictures and videos he's captured, how long he would watch before making himself known to us. I used to convince myself that these were several unrelated instances, because it scared me more to think that one person had the capacity to invest so much time into us. It seems like an odd revenge for outrunning him years before. A few years back when I was 19, I had just gotten my first apartment in the basement of an apartment complex. That might sound odd, but a friend's mother talked to the apartment's landlord to find me a cheap place to live. This was in Denver, so it wasn't cheap for a one-bedroom apartment in most places. This is all relevant later. The basement apartment was a studio located at the base of a flight of stairs. It was the only apartment at the bottom of these stairs, between the apartment's boiler room and laundry area. Even farther down a brick hallway with a screen door, and landing before you finally got to my apartment door. The first few months of living alone were fine. There was a smoking area up the flight of stairs that led to my apartment. One day I was up there having a cigarette when a Native American man sat next to me and also started smoking. He was a resident in the apartment. His name was John. John seemed mostly normal, maybe a little lonely, but nothing unnerving. He said he lived alone and he was an artist. We chatted until my cigarette was through. I said goodbye to John and went back downstairs. I would see John occasionally, smoking, as I was going to or from work. He always just said hi to me and never gave off any red flags, which makes all this all the more creepy. One night, as I was laying there asleep, I woke up to the sound of the doorknob to my apartment jiggling. It was like someone was frantically trying to break the lock. I got out of bed and immediately grabbed a knife from the kitchenette. If this had been a normal room in the apartment complex, someone would have heard the doorknob rattling, but my apartment was secluded on the subterranean level. I stood right next to the jiggling doorknob and said, "Hello? Who's there?" No one answered. I looked through the peephole, but it was way too dark to see. I said to the door in a loud and confident voice, "If you come in here, I will kill you." I was serious about it too. Back then I was pretty fearless and in a not-so-great mental state. Just explaining because some people questioned my reaction to this event. The jiggling immediately stopped. Whoever it was booked it back through the screen door, down the hallway, and up the dark flight of stairs. I don't know if they thought I was asleep until then or what, but I think I scared them. I could see their dark outline going up the stairs through the peephole, but I couldn't make out the person's features. I made a mistake that night when I decided not to call the cops. I felt like it would be a hassle, and that it was probably just some drunk person causing a bit of mischief. My heart was pounding from the adrenaline, but I felt confident I could take care of myself, and I mostly put the incident out of my mind. About a week later, very late at night, at around 2 a.m., I woke up and realized the door to my apartment was wide open. I was in shock. I couldn't really process what I was looking at. I walked towards the door, wondering how someone could have just come and left while making no sound. I remember my heart was beating furiously, and it was difficult to breathe. Every footstep felt like I was walking further into a fatal danger zone. I examined the door. The doorknob had been completely removed from its socket. I don't know how he broke the doorknob out of there without waking me up. I've entertained many possibilities. Maybe he used a knife and carved it out. Maybe it wasn't fastened securely in the first place, and it just popped out on accident. But it held pretty sturdily when he was jiggling it the week before. I'm a fairly light sleeper, so I just don't understand how he could have done that. It still bothers me to this day. There was a clean hole where the doorknob was mounted to the door, and the doorknob was gone. I never did manage to find it. The kitchen knife I had threatened the intruder with the week before was lying on the ground next to my bed. Maybe I'd gotten up and put it next to me in my sleep. I don't know. It's all a mystery to me, and that's why this occurrence still bothers me so much. I just can't figure it out. A person had been in my room, possibly watching me sleep for a while, but they had left without doing anything bad to me. I'm lucky, I guess, but I'll never really know why. I bought a deadbolt for the door and had the doorknob replaced. Since people will probably ask, I did not call the cops. Like I said, I was in a very bad mental state. I didn't really have a lot of energy to care about myself, but that's besides the point. I was really on edge for the next few weeks, but nothing happened until a few weeks later, when the guy tried to break in again in broad daylight. He was doing his doorknob jiggling routine again. I looked out, and I saw this time that it was John, completely drunk. I know because I yelled at him, and he scurried drunkenly back up the stairs just like the first time. Apparently, he was known for having a bad drinking problem. After that time, the entire complex knew what he'd done, and the owner of the building urged me to press charges. I believe they also evicted John. I didn't press charges, however, for the aforementioned reasons. I moved out very shortly after anyway. Like I said, the unanswered questions still haunt me. What did he want? Was it him that broke in? Was it all just a nasty trick my own mind played on itself? I'll never really know. Many years ago, when I must have been in about grade 5 or 6, my parents started working more, leading to me having to catch the bus and walk the rest of the way back home. There was nothing bad about this, and I enjoyed the walks quite a lot too. I'd been doing it for about a year, and each day I noticed the same man parked in a driveway with his dark blue ute, and almost every time a cigarette in his mouth. I saw him 2 days in a row the first time, and thought nothing of him. A few days passed without me seeing him. Then the next week I walked past the house and his car was there with no one in it. I felt uneasy walking past it though, and as I did I noticed a camera poorly hidden away, just in front of the steering wheel. I pretended not to notice it, but in my head I knew exactly why it was there. For the rest of the week, that camera was there. At the end of the week, he'd sit in his car and check his watch as soon as I walked by. He was trying to figure out the time that I came past him. I wanted to take a different route home, but I couldn't really do much else, as the only way would always inevitably result with me walking past this house. For maybe a month, he'd be sitting in his car staring at me each time. I still don't know if he thought I couldn't see him, because he was really bad at being discreet. Then one day he was leaning on his car door. As I walked past, he said something along the lines of, "Hey mate, you need a ride home?" Obviously, I said no. He kept on trying to get a yes from me, but I never stopped refusing. I could tell he was getting mad, and he could tell that I knew too, so he calmed down and told me sorry. The next day, I see his ute drive up behind me. He slows down as he comes next to me and rolls down his window, asking me if I wanted to ride again. He drove off the first time I said no this time. It goes maybe a week or two without seeing him. After I thought I would never have to see him again, suddenly he drives past. He asked the exact same question, and when I refused, he just told me to get into the car. I said that I wasn't getting in, that he can leave me alone. He changed his tone a lot, and that's when he told me he had a gun. I lived in a small Australian city, and the chances of him having a gun are next to zero. It was easy to tell he was trying to scare me. He then played it off as a joke after I was unfazed, and leaned over to open the door. "Get in, mate. It's much better in here than out there where it's hot. I've got air conditioning. It's 38 degrees Celsius outside, you know. You probably know all about stranger danger and all that, but I promise that's not who I am. Hop on in." I remember that word for word, and it scares me to think of that to this day. "No, my house is right here. Leave me alone, please." The only problem was, my house was still half a kilometer away at the very least. I proceeded to walk up to a random house's driveway and knock on the door. I had no idea who these people were. He stared at me as I waited for the door to open. I heard the doorknob turn, and before the person could even say anything, I bumped past them and got inside. Now that I think about it, it might have been just as dangerous to enter a random person's house than a random person's car. The man's expression changed, and he sped off after the house owner glared at him. The owner was a very nice old woman. I told her that he tried to convince me to go into his car. She called my parents right away, and I waited outside of her house for them to arrive. My mom was so grateful, and my dad was pretty much in shock. My mom then constantly visited the old lady, as she lived alone and she wanted to be nice. I never really thought as a kid about how lucky I was that the house I entered wasn't the wrong one to go into. I try not to think about that whole experience, because it all genuinely terrifies me. I don't know what happened to the man. Never saw him again, and I definitely don't miss him. What is up, guys? Blue Spooky here, as always. Thank you guys so much for watching, especially if you made it this far to the end of the video. I hope you guys are enjoying this sort of daily upload thing. I'm trying to upload as much as possible while I still have the time to, mostly because I find it fun and there's not much else to do while COVID is around, so I hope you guys are enjoying that. If you guys liked the video, please be sure to like, share, comment, and subscribe if you feel so inclined. These stories were all submitted to me through my email by subscribers. If you guys would also like to submit stories for me to read in the video, please be sure to take a look in the description below. It will have links to all my social media, including my Facebook, Gmail, and Twitter accounts. You can go ahead and send me a message on any of those, and I'll try to get back to your story as soon as possible. If you do decide to send in a story, please be sure to include as much detail as you feel comfortable with, so I can make it a nice, healthy, long video. Also, please be sure to include in the tagline what the name of the story is if it has one, the theme of the story if it has one, and how you would like to be credited in the description of the video the story appears in. Also, make sure you use proper grammar and spatial paragraphs and all that stuff, because it's kind of hard to read wall of text submissions. If you guys are new to the channel and you like this, I have two other channels, one where I do disaster documentaries, and another one where I do true crime videos. I do both of those once a week. You'll find links to those in the description as well. Those are called Mr. Blue Skies and Darkest Hour, respectively. Special thanks to my artist. His links to his social media will be in the description below. He does all of my artwork for this channel, and he does the thumbnails as well. If you like his art, so you can check his social media out, and he'll be able to get you something real cool if you're in the mood for that. If you guys are curious about the music, it's listed in the description below in the order which it appears with links to the artists. Other than that, I think that's pretty much it for now, guys. Thank you guys so much for watching, and I hope you guys have a great day.
Good evening all, and welcome. I hope you're sitting comfortably. Is that someone at your window? No. No, of course it's not. I apologize, it was my mistake. As I was saying, tonight we're going to be recounting some Home Alone horror stories. I'm sure you're all fine, and that there's no one peering in through those windows. But for now, it's time to get comfortable and let the darkness take control. Let me start off this story by giving you a bit of background information. I'm a 19-year-old male currently living in Melbourne, Australia. Keep in mind that I'm pretty short for a guy, only 5'8", and not very muscular. As a result, I've always felt defenseless whenever I was confronted with people who were larger than me, which explains why I spent the majority of my teenage years at home, mainly because that's where I felt the safest. But in one moment of my life, that all changed. My entire perception on the notion of safety was completely and utterly destroyed. I was 17 when this took place. My parents had left for the weekend, as it was their 20-year wedding anniversary. I have 3 siblings, 2 of which are older brothers, both of whom have places of their own. My younger sister was staying at a friend's house during this particular weekend, so it was just me in the house. This is how I liked it. Nothing could prepare me for the fear that awaited me. There aren't words to describe the sheer horror I felt through my experience. On several occasions, I had read stories of people going through similar situations as my own, but never truly understood them until that day. It was around 11 p.m. on Saturday. I was watching my favorite TV show upstairs when I thought I heard a noise coming from downstairs. I paused my show so I could hear the sound more clearly. My suspicions were confirmed when I heard what sounded like a faint knock at the front door. Come to think of it, it sounded more like a tap. Now, I'm a pretty paranoid person, so I would often jump to the worst case scenario in these types of situations. But on this particular occasion, I just dismissed the sound entirely and continued watching my show. After finishing a few more episodes, I decided to go downstairs to get a drink. Just to give you an idea of the way my house was laid out, this staircase is located directly opposite my front door. Just left of the staircase is a very small hallway which leads into a larger room that contains my kitchen and the family room. In fact, the hallway is so small that you could practically see into the kitchen from the door. As I headed downstairs, I immediately noticed that the front door was unlocked. I knew this because the lock on the front door was positioned horizontally. This was a little alarming, as I could have sworn that I had locked it after my parents left for the weekend. In fact, I remember double-checking it to be sure. Like I previously mentioned, I'm a paranoid guy. In spite of this, I just locked it again and stupidly disregarded it. After I finished my drink, I decided to go to my bed because it was pretty late, and I have to admit I was very tired. Before heading upstairs, I turned off all the lights in the house, as this was routine whenever I went to bed. About 20 minutes into my sleep, I awoke to what sounded like the door closing downstairs. It couldn't have been the front door, as I was positive that I locked it before going upstairs. Plus, I knew that no one else had a key to the house other than my parents. Now, I've seen enough horror movies to know that you do not, under any circumstances, go investigate any unexplainable sound, especially when every gut instinct is telling you not to. But what I can say, in my sleep-deprived state, I made a misjudgment. I very slowly walked downstairs, trying to make as little noise as possible. I knew that a few of the steps made creaking sounds whenever weight was applied to the center of the step, so I did my best to stay as close to the edge of each step as possible. By the time I got to the bottom floor, my heart rate was higher than it has ever been in the circumstances. By this time, my eyes had adjusted to the dark, so I could make out the outline of the furniture scattered throughout my house. And still to this day, I believe that is what saved my life. Had I bumped into anything, it would have given away my position. As I slowly peered my head around the corner of the staircase, words cannot describe the sheer horror I felt when I saw the outline of a man standing in my kitchen. He was a very tall 6'5", well built, and I felt as though I was in a freezer as my blood ran cold. I was paralyzed with fear. I knew he hadn't seen me because he made no sudden movements or any change in his behavior that indicated otherwise. When I finally had the strength back in my legs, I forced myself to saunter backwards while trying not to make one sound, because if I did, I knew that I would be dead. The feeling a person gets when they know that each step they could take could be their last is a feeling I don't wish on my worst enemy. As I got closer and closer to the upstairs bedroom, I felt as though my heart had exploded in my chest, when a loud creak echoed through the house. At that moment, I knew I was screwed. My entire life flashed before my eyes in one fleeting image. I sprinted upstairs and closed myself in the bedroom. The worst part was knowing that none of the doors in the house had locks on them, not even the bathroom. All he had to do was to turn the wooden handle to my bedroom, and I'd be done for. The sound of boots thumping up the wooden stairs brought me closer to my death. I frantically looked around my room for anything to use as a weapon. There was nothing besides a pen laying on my desk. I grabbed it and held onto it so tight in anticipation that I actually started to feel the blood supply to my hand being cut off. I braced myself. The next thing I heard nearly made me throw up. I'll never forget the fear I felt till the day I die. A deep voice coming from directly outside my bedroom door which said, "I know you're in there, and I'm going to kill you." At that moment, the door burst open with force. Instinctively, I swung my arm towards it as hard as I could, and with a stroke of luck, I managed to drive the pen right into this guy's shoulder. He let out a blood-chilling scream and collapsed on the floor in agony. I used this opportunity to sprint downstairs and out the front door, where I immediately ran into my neighbor's house. I kept banging on the door until they opened up. After explaining what had happened, my neighbor called the police, and I waited with them until they arrived. By the time they entered my house to investigate, the man was gone. To this day, I still don't know if they ever found him, but fortunately, I have never seen him again. This happened to me last Thursday, and I can't stop thinking about it. I'm a 30-year-old female who lives with my fiancé and our 2 dogs. I have 2 huskies, one is 2 and one is only 4 months. My huskies are not guard dogs, to save their lives. They don't bark nor howl. These dogs just love people too much. My brother-in-law and friends have walked in on multiple occasions, and the dogs don't make a peep. So anyway, it's 8 p.m, it's dark out, and I'm home alone. My fiancé had a hockey game, and I'm in the bathroom with the door closed and the blow dryer going, so I can't really hear anything going on around me. That is, until I hear one of the dogs howl, I stop the blow dry and listen, thinking that the dogs are fighting again. Then I hear a faint knock, and the dogs start going apeshit, barking, howling, jumping into the bay windows, so badly that I thought they'd break it. I think, what the hell is making them go crazy like that? Maybe it's another dog or skunk. I look out my bedroom window, as it was the closest view to the front door for me. Well, lo and behold, there are two men in black hoodies, standing there in the front. They start knocking loudly, and this time my 2-year-old husky jumps from the bay window to the front door and starts growling and ramming his body into the door. I'm watching this from my bedroom as the dog jumps into the door. One of the men jumps back startled, looks at the other guy, and they just walk away. I called my fiancée to get home ASAP. I watched them walk away down the road. They weren't selling anything, and they didn't stop in any of the houses. I was so creeped out. Thank goodness for my crazy dogs. This happened when I was around 9 years old. I'm 25 now, and it's something I will never forget. It gives me goosebumps to this day. I live in a terraced house, 4 houses combined, and my neighborhood and I each have our own little patio. There's a small road 10 meters from my yard where people do their Sunday walks on. Only a small fence separates my yard and patio from that road. I live in a pretty crowded area with several of these terraced houses spread around in my neighborhood, so seeing people walking on that road is pretty normal for me. Seeing random people standing on my patio is not. When I was 9, I usually got home from school about an hour before my mum got home from work. I live maybe 50 meters away from school, so my mum figured I was mature enough to be home alone for around an hour before she got home. This one day, I got home from school. I did the usual thing, which was to make sure I locked the front door and double-checked that the back door leading to the patio was also locked. I was 9. Being alone was a little scary, even though it was in the middle of the day and only for an hour. I then rushed to my room upstairs to play as much PlayStation as possible before my mum came home and made me do homework. While playing, I heard this noise coming from outside my window, as my room was located 1 floor over the patio, with a view to the road, as I told you about before. It was kind of like the sound of cats, but my cats had been missing for over 3 months. Hope sparked and I thought, oh my god, did he finally come back? I ran downstairs to check if it was my cat, but the sight that met me still gives me goosebumps to this day. There was a guy standing on my patio, a tall guy with black hair covering half of his eyes, making him look like the male version of the girl from The Ring. I could hear him making high-pitched sounds, almost like a cat meowing. A brown liquid was running down his mouth. I could see him spitting out my dad's stomped cigarettes. He was actually eating them from the ashtray. I was frozen observing this. Eventually, snapped out of it and screamed so loudly that the man must have heard it. He didn't react. He kept on eating from the ashtray. I ran upstairs to my room, locked the door and called my mum, who then called the cops. I have never been more terrified in my life, laying in bed under my sheets, shivering with fear, as I hear this creepy guy make those horrible noises whilst eating cigarette stumps from the ashtray on the patio. I kind of blacked out for a moment, because the next thing I remember is the police arriving on the road by my yard. I hear them talking to the guy, saying stuff like, "What are you doing? Get over here or we'll come down and arrest you," and so on. He didn't respond, but the high-pitched sound was more frequent and louder. I decided to look through the window, feeling safe now that the cops were there. I could see 2 police officers standing by my fence, one man and a woman. I didn't see the creepy man, however, because he was standing directly 1 story under me and my field of view. The police jumped the fence, and I remember hearing the creepy guy screaming louder than anything I've ever heard before. He charged the female police officer with full force, and he knocked her out cold. The male police officer immediately then tased the guy, leaving him shaking on the ground, screaming still. The policeman struggled to keep him on the ground while putting handcuffs on him, but eventually made it. After a while, he managed to wake up the female police officer, who seemed to be badly hurt. He called for backup and an ambulance, and then he sees me standing in the window above him. The expression on my face must have been something else, because he just looked at me and said, "I sure as hell hope you didn't see all of that." I started to cry. By this time, neighbors started to arrive, wondering what the hell was going on. One of my neighbors, an elderly woman, made me come down, and she took care of me until my mum got back. The police took the creepy guy with them in the car and left. Before they left, they promised to come back and talk to us about what had happened. This is where the story takes an unexpected turn. The male police officer came back later that night and sat down with me and my mum to talk. He explained that the guy on my patio was actually diagnosed with severe autism. He had escaped a facility where mentally challenged people lived, located around 5 kilometers from where I live. He explained that the guy had actually been living in my house 5 years ago, but had been forced to move when his mum, his only caretaker, died. The poor guy probably thought he would find his mum in my house. He missed the routines, and he missed living there with his mum. The police had to move him from the house, that time 5 years ago, because he was extremely strong. From what I heard, he has extreme tensions in the body because of his autism, making his muscles grow stronger and stronger throughout the years. This was the reason he reacted the way he did when the police came that day. Still frightened, I told the police officer that he needed to make sure this would never happen again, and he promised it wouldn't. After a few sleepless nights, my life got back to normal. 3 years went by and the guy didn't come back, until a year ago. This time, my mum and dad had moved out. I bought the house from them, and I'm still living there today. I was enjoying my morning coffee on the patio when I see this random guy stopping on the road by my fence. He stands there, looking at me. I look at him and give him a nod, and then I hear the high-pitched noises. Oh shit, that's him. His hair had turned grey, but the high-pitched sounds made me realize. My heart started racing, and I instantly remembered the reason why he was back. I realized that he must have managed to escape again, but I kept my cool a bit longer, because back then I was 9. I started to feel sorry for this guy. 16 years later, and he was back to look for his mum. I decided to carefully ask him if he wanted to come down to the patio. He instantly jumped the fence, and I started to think he would knock me out like he did to that police officer. He didn't. He smiled, I smiled, and I offered him to sit down. He didn't respond. I offered him to come inside, and he started laughing. We went in, and his face lit up with pure joy. He was home. It reminded him of the life he had with his mum. It almost made me tear up. All of a sudden, he sat down on my couch, turned on the TV, and switched directly to the cartoons. I observed him for a while. He was just completely focused on the cartoons. I just wanted him to enjoy the moment, so I didn't say anything to him. I realized I had to call the facility to let them know. The caretakers arrived 10 minutes later, and after a lot of convincing, he got back up, crying, and they went back to the facility. I called the facility 2 days later, and we made a deal. His name is Tom, and I now consider Tom my friend. Every Sunday from the day he returned, Tom and his caretakers will visit me to watch cartoons. They say it's the highlight of his week. It makes my heart warm. Now, for several years, my thoughts were, let's not meet guy on the patio eating from the ashtray. Now my thoughts are, let's meet every Sunday to watch cartoons. My friend, Tom. Just a few days ago, I was home, minding my own business, studying for an exam. I was kind of stressed out and couldn't really focus on anything. It was midday. The doorbell rang, so I got up and opened the door. There was a man, mid-30s, average build, who looked like a construction worker. He asked me if my parents were home because he needs $50 to fix a pipe. I told him no, they're not, and he asked me when they were coming. I told him I lived with my boyfriend, and I asked why does he need money, since we just paid $35 to the building administration. He said those are for other things, and that this is an emergency. That my neighbors had called him because on our side of the building, the eaves were broken and the water was dripping on the windows. He then asked me to talk to my boyfriend about the money, and I told him to come back later because he wasn't home. He told me to ask him when he was coming back because the problem needs urgent care. I closed the door, grabbed my phone, and asked him. Red flag. Is it a pipe or the eaves that are broken? I wanted to ask him which neighbors had called him, if he could give me a receipt, and exactly how much this was going to cost. But at this point I had gotten a little scared. I'm a 100-pound girlie. I actually look like a kid, which is why he asked for my parents, even though I'm 22. The way he talked was also weird. I don't know how to describe it. It just had a mean/crazy vibe to it. So, you know, he could have knocked me over with the door. I also felt incredibly stupid to have told him I was home alone, but he kept asking to talk to the other people. It was my first instinct. Anyway, my boyfriend said he would come home in an hour. I didn't tell him the whole story because the guy was waiting outside. I opened the door again, and I decided I would rather talk to him than make him angry by not opening the door. The door to our apartment is an old wooden door. We live in a cheap rented apartment, so I didn't feel protected enough by it. There I am. I open the door and tell him it's going to be an hour till he comes back, and that I'm very sorry for the inconvenience. He says it's all right, and that he'll come back later. Except he didn't leave immediately. He asked me about our rent, if we worked, if we were students, to which I barely replied. I work, we're both students. I can't give you any more details. I can't tell you the amount of money I pay for my rent. He then proceeded to ask me if I knew other girls such as myself, who were cute and looking for a partner. Someone 25 to 30 years old. That he's a good guy, a city guy, and it's really hard to find a good girl. He probably took about 5 minutes to explain this and grill me for telephone numbers of girls who would not hang up on him. I tried to be as nice as possible and explained to him I only had friends my age and that they were all in relationships as far as I knew. He asked me a couple of more times, but I kept telling him the same thing, so he gave up. He asked me if my boyfriend and I had been together for long, to which I replied that we'd been together for 2 years. He wished us good luck, and something that would translate to, "May you have a future long marriage." He asked me in which apartment the administrator lived, and when I told him, he finally left. I told my boyfriend everything, and he came home as swiftly as he was able. By this point, I felt like puking. I was so scared. I had given away too much info while trying to keep him calm. He immediately said it was a scam and went downstairs to talk to the administrator. She told him he had knocked on her door and asked her for $15 and that the girl on the third floor, me, had sent him. She also told him she knew he was a scammer and not to worry, just to be careful. I am scared. It seems like he's planning a robbery, like he's gotten into the building as someone must have opened the door for him. He's inspected the doors and chose ours because, well, it's not the best door. He asked for money to see if we had it on hand. He asked for the price of rent to see if we have money and if the stuff in the apartment is of value. Maybe we've been tagged. Or maybe asking for money really was the whole plan and for someone to fall for it. But why choose me or my apartment when there are about 14 others? Weirdly enough, I feel like he was nice to me. He was calm and didn't try to convince me to give him the money. He tried to get my parents and then my boyfriend to be his target. He took pity on me. Nevertheless, we've been sleeping with all our interior doors open to hear if someone tries to break into our apartment, and we try not to leave it empty for long periods of time. Living in constant fear, living the dream. So, I grew up in Las Vegas. I'd moved there when I was in second grade. I was around 7 or so. My mother was working at some sort of motorcycle repair shop in Arizona that just wasn't paying the bills all that well. So she jumped at the offer of a new job. Fast forward about 5 years. I'm in middle school now. My brother and I were almost exactly 2 years apart. I was about to turn 12, so he was 10 at the time. My mother, being quite low on the seniority list, was forced to work late nights. That left me and my brother home alone after school more often than not. Our nights were usually pretty uneventful, usually consisting of us avoiding whatever homework was assigned, warming up leftovers in the microwave, and watching whatever sparked our interest on the TV, which was usually either WWE wrestling or some kind of cartoon. We usually ended up in bed before our mum got home, but occasionally, we'd wait up for her. One night, or I suppose one afternoon, considering it was still broad daylight, everything was pretty normal. My brother sat on the living room floor, engulfed in whatever was going on the TV, and I was using my mum's desktop computer feeding my virtual pets. Then there was a rather aggressive knock at the door, which was very odd. I was sort of an outcast child. I didn't really have too many friends, nor did my brother. Even then, we lived in what you would consider a senior living community. My mother was the youngest adult there, and was around her mid-30s. My brother, being too short to reach the peephole, doesn't move, and only slightly reacts and looks at me. I get up from the computer chair and make my way to the front door to glance out the peephole. I see a man in a black ski mask staring back at me through the peephole. It definitely didn't seem real. It sort of seemed like something from a cliché movie, as if he were dressed to rob a bank. I was immediately scared shitless, and I obviously didn't bother asking who it was. I silently stepped away, shut off the TV, grabbed my brother and our small black Pomeranian, and ran back towards my bedroom. Once we were safely hidden in my closet, I informed him of what was outside. He didn't say much, but was visibly shaken up, just quietly stood there holding our dog. I slid the tiny flip phone our mom left us for emergencies from my pocket and dialed 911. I whispered to the operator the entirety of the call, as I didn't think the man had left, considering the knocks persisted after we left the living room. Yet somehow, she understood me and sent an officer over. Immediately after the call ended with the operator, I dialed for my mother. I explained everything to her, and she ended up leaving work early and came home around the same time the police did. I'm not sure what deterred him from pursuing further, but of course the man had gone by the time they both arrived. The officer was very clearly not taking any of it seriously, most likely thinking that these two young boys were just paranoid from staying home alone. It was probably some young man playing a joke on some of his friends. However, like I stated previously, we lived in a senior living community. Who could possibly be playing a joke on us? His dear grandmother? He then gave my brother and I stickers, as if that would console our nerves after seeing some masked man pounding on the door. Fortunately, I never saw the stranger after that. After that experience, my house, however, was broken into, as well as my car 3 times. But thankfully none of us were present when all of this took place. Since then, my family and I have moved out of state and have installed a security system. Never in my then short life had I ever really considered the concept of actual fear. I loved horror movies. My father was constantly renting them for me, despite my mother's protest. I loved that sort of fear. The tingle in your stomach when the music starts to get tense and the character in the movie does not see something behind them, and you're anxiously awaiting the climax of the sudden jump. That is a fun fear. What I felt that autumn night when I was 8 years old was much, much different. I grew up in north of Toronto, in a really beautiful town. We had a gorgeous, big 2-story house that even now, 17 years later, I still consider home in a strange way. It certainly was not a small town by any means. It wasn't quaint, and wasn't the sort of place that everyone knew each other and where no one locked their doors. In general, though, it was safe. There was the occasional stranger danger stories that would circulate about kids seeing someone in the forest or ravines or areas surrounding the town. Being a family of all girls, we were taught the basics: always lock the doors, never talk to strangers, and never accept rides. It was the beginning of fall, where the maple tree leaves started to turn amazing reds and oranges, and it would get dark much earlier. It was around 8, and the sun had already fully set. My parents and older sister were all out, leaving my middle sister Kay and I home alone. Kay decides she wants to have a friend over, and wants us to walk and meet her halfway. It was realistically only about a 5-minute walk to get there, although at the time it seemed like a huge adventure. Kay could not find her house. We searched for a while, with no luck. While she continued searching, I remembered my parents kept a hidden key in the garage for emergencies. In this particular house, there was no direct door connecting the garage to the house. You had to open the actual garage door to get it. Or there was a side regular door. Since I had no key, I opened the garage door. I remember very clearly finding the key, and as I got back to the keypad to close it, I saw headlights. I anticipated seeing a familiar vehicle, seeing my parents or my sister arriving home, but that was not what I was met with. Pulled halfway up my drive about 10 feet from where I was standing was a beige Montana minivan. I heard the slight sound of a window rolling down, a car door opening, and my eyes finally focused on the figure of a man, one arm fully out of the window, along with his torso and head. He held the door ajar too, easy access to jumping out if he decided to. He was a big man, completely bald, shaved down to the skin, shiny sort of head bald, and he had a thick soul patch on his chin. It was probably only a few seconds, but it felt like an eternity until he finally spoke. I remember there was a lightness to his voice. I think at the time, it probably took a friendly tone. But as an adult now, I wonder if it wasn't a more sickening excitement he may have felt at the opportunity he saw. Are you home alone? This is the fear I was talking about. A muscle-stiffening, stomach-churning fear. This is the sort of fear you see in horror movies, where the person is too afraid to move. That physically freezing fear is what I felt. I was 8 years old and tiny. I had no chance. The garage was empty, the driveway was empty, no cars, no signs of adults, no hope. I felt like I was outside my body, watching this happen to another little girl. It wasn't happening to me. I couldn't be taken or hurt. That sort of stuff doesn't actually happen. I heard this weird echoing noise coming from somewhere, my body still frozen. It wasn't until he was hurling himself back into his vehicle and squealing his tires as he violently reversed off my driveway that I realized my sister had opened the front door. I assume he didn't want to take a chance of who could have been opening the door, so he took off. My parents eventually came home, and the police came and we filled out our report. Nothing came of it. No man was ever found, and the stories raged in our neighborhood of the occasional creepy encounters that other kids had. I have no idea what may have happened had my sister not come to the door at that moment. I try not to imagine what a grown man in a minivan could have done with a tiny 8-year-old girl. I know some people hate these whole let's not meet endings, but hey, when in Rome, I hope to never ever meet the man I saw that night again. I hope to God no other little girl does either. This happened a few months ago in the dead cold winter. I remember being home alone. My parents had gone out to the bar for their friend's birthday, and my little sister was at my cousin's house for a sleepover. My dog and I were the only two in the house, which is sometimes a bit scary for me, because it's late at night. I don't really like being by myself, mostly because I would have no way to defend myself if something happened. I'm a 15-year-old, 5'1" girl, and I can't cause much damage. I'm also a very overly paranoid person, which sucks with these situations. It was probably around 11 PM. I got up from watching something on my laptop to get snacks and feed my dog. When I came into the kitchen, my dog was staring at my back door and growling. Our back door is glass, so when I looked outside, all I saw was black. "Do you want to go outside?" I asked my dog. But she just continued to stare and growl at the door. I shrugged it off as her being in a defensive mood for no reason. Or she saw an animal. She's a little dog, but she thinks she's tough. I grabbed a snack out of the pantry and went over to my dog by the door. I picked her up and take her into my room when our motion-activated light turns on. I looked up expecting to see an animal scurrying away, but oh no, I saw the figure of a man. He was wearing a black hoodie, and I could barely make out his face. I knew he was staring at me. I stared at him, and he ran off, hopping over my back fence and into my neighbor's yard, leaving tons of footprints in the snow. This freaked me out. I began to cry, and I called my mother, who was slightly drunk, and told her what I saw. She began to freak out over the phone, and I heard her talking to my dad. They both told me they'd be back, but to call the police in the meantime. I hung up, dialed 911, and explained what happened to the dispatcher. She calmed me down as I was having a pretty bad anxiety attack, telling me that it would all be okay, and the police would be there as soon as possible. I heard banging on the door after what felt like hours. Even though it was probably only 10 minutes, the police began talking to me. I was a tiny bit calmer than I was before. They explained to me that they would inspect the backyard and wait for my parents to get home. My parents finally got home. They weren't too far, which was good, and the police told them a patrol car would be staying around here. They explained to my parents that a house about a mile up had recently been robbed while the owners were gone. The footprints they found in the snow matched the ones that were at the other house. This freaked my parents and I out, of course, but the police assured us that they would be on the lookout around this area. I never found out what happened to the man, but I hope that he got caught. This happened several years ago, when I lived with my ex-boyfriend. We had recently moved into a 2-bedroom house and set to work turning it into a home. We turned the back bedroom into an office, as the house only had the 1 bathroom, and it could only be reached through this bedroom. We would have people crash on our sofa pretty regularly, and didn't fancy them have to traipse through our bedroom to get to the loo in the middle of the night. So we'd be living there for roughly 1 month when this event occurred. My ex was out with work colleagues and I was home alone. I'd spent the early evening watching TV and eating takeout. A couple of times I heard some strange noises, but whatever. I would try and zone in on them to figure out what the hell it was. It would stop. It got later, and I decided to go upstairs and use the computer for a little while before heading to bed. At this point in time, we hadn't had our phone line installed, and I was still on a pay-as-you-go phone, which had run out of credit. I basically had no way to communicate with anyone whilst I was in the house that night. So I'm sitting in the back room with only a small table lamp on that barely forms a glow, whilst I'm typing away on my laptop, when I heard noises again. It started as a light rattling noise, really faint, to the point I had to strain to see if I was really hearing it or imagining it. I shut my music off and tried to figure out what it was. I went into our bedroom and looked down to the front door. Nobody there. Go back into the back bedroom, but can't see much out the window. We had a small yard with a huge brick wall and a solid wooden gate, with nothing to cast any light. But from what little I could see, there was nothing out back there either. I sat back down and switched the music on. Maybe 10 minutes later, I hear this eerie screeching sound like metal on metal. Again, very faint, as if whatever was making it was trying to desperately be quiet. I was getting more than a little freaked out at this point, so I went into our bedroom to retrieve this heavy iron rod that we'd found when we built the back of the wardrobe. I didn't switch on any lights, as I knew that that was going to alert any possible intruder to my location. Remember, I had no way of calling anyone, and I was getting more than a little concerned someone might actually be in my house. I made my way back into the office/bedroom and closed the door as quietly as possible, before bolting it and lodging a chair under the handle. Nothing more happens for a good 20 minutes or so. I start to feel a little foolish for letting myself get worked up, and put it down to being alone for the first time in the house. But I don't switch the music back on this time, which was lucky because I started to hear what sounds like 2 people whispering, both male voices. They didn't sound like they were coming from inside the house though. I had the office/bedroom window open ever so slightly, and the sound seemed to be floating in from there. I headed into the bathroom to see if I could get a better look into the alley that the house backed onto. The office/bedroom and the bathroom formed an L around the yard, with the bathroom extending further out. I climbed up onto the ledge and inched the window open to try and see out into the alley. I couldn't see a thing, but the whispering was loud and coming from directly behind my gate. I couldn't hear whole sentences, but heard enough to summarize whoever these men were. They'd seen us move in, and I'd seen we had quite a lot of valuable equipment. Guitars, computers, DSLRs, TVs, gaming consoles. I imagined they'd seen I was home alone, and had been waiting for me to go to sleep and try to get into the house. I'd stayed perched there for what felt like an eternity, until what seemed like the loudest thud in the world echoed up to me. They'd grown tired of trying to be stealthy, and one or both of them were throwing themselves at my gate, trying to break it down. I could see it shuddering under the blows, and could only imagine how large these men must be. I'm a tiny girl, all of 5'3", and at this point weighed somewhere around 105 pounds. As you can imagine, I was white with terror. As I watched my gate groan from the stress, I sat, clutching that iron rod, trying to think where I could hide from them. Suddenly, a glaring light blinded me. At first I panicked and dropped out of sight, thinking they were shining a torch at the back of the house, but then I heard barking and shouting. I peeked out the window again and saw the house, which was across the alley from us, had a floodlight installed, and it was illuminating both their own yard, mine, and the alley with the light. I heard grumbling and footsteps as the two hurried down the alley. I stayed locked in that back bedroom until my ex-boyfriend drunkenly rolled in at about 4 a.m. I didn't sleep a wink that night, and when I went into the yard in the morning, my gate was hanging on by one hinge, allowing easy access from the alley. When I looked at the back of it, the keyhole was covered in scratches, as if someone had tried to force the lock. If they hadn't woken the house behind us, I dread to think what would have happened. I live out in the middle of nowhere with my mum and 2 sisters. We had all gotten into a massive fight over pizza of all things, and my mum and 2 sisters stormed off and left me home alone. I was very angry. I'm not going to go into the details of the argument, as thinking back on it, I was wrong and it was pathetic, which as a moody teenager is something quite hard to admit in the heat of the moment. Nonetheless, I wasn't in a good mood, and I was sitting there in the dark in my room, sulking in my fury. After about an hour, I had got bored of doing nothing, so I began playing some video games on my phone. My family hadn't come back yet, and I speculated, given the length of time they'd been, that they had probably gone to visit our grandparents. That's what they usually did on a Friday night anyway. I sat there, entertaining myself, when all of a sudden I started hearing something. It was coming from the background. It was like people were approaching the house, a continual buzz of noise and talking. I poked my head past the curtain and looked out the window to see a bunch of people walking towards our house from the woods. They were all wearing black robes. The thing is, I thought it would be scarier, but because of the laughter and the continual talk, I wondered who they were and why they were dressed so oddly. They didn't feel remotely threatening. I watched tentatively from my dark room, and they all seemed to stop at the house. That's when I realized they weren't here to carry on walking. They'd come with a purpose, and outside my house they'd stopped and were starting to inspect it. I assumed, in the heat of the moment, that they were there to practice some kind of ritual, maybe some kind of cult, and that I was their chosen victim. I tried telling myself it was bullshit, and thought that I should call my mum, but I was still pissed, so I decided against it, thinking I could brave on the cult alone. The fury was still pumping through my veins, and I was angry, so I rushed downstairs as I heard people fiddling with the locks. I went and grabbed all the kitchen knives I could and held them out like Freddy Krueger style. I opened the back porch door, taking the people who were fiddling there completely by surprise, and yelled out incredibly loudly whilst holding knife in hand. I wasn't sure what was going to happen. Perhaps I was just feeling ballsy because of my fury. But my screams echoed through the night, and the person just stared at me and went, "Sorry, wrong house," and the group quickly dispersed and ran back into the woods. I couldn't believe my luck. I had single-handedly chased off the cult. And after a few hours, when my family got back and the adrenaline had worn off, I apologized reluctantly and then told them about my encounter. Of course, none of them believed me, and it was quickly dismissed and forgotten about. But about 3 years later, in the local news, reports that a group of hooded individuals were going to people's houses, causing harm and stealing stuff. There was even a case where they found a guy dead, stabbed in the woods. I wonder, if I hadn't have taken them by surprise, would I still be alive today? Would my fury have cost me my life? Could they have come into the house and ended me? Some things are best not dwelling on. This happened 2 nights ago. Around 8 p.m, my boyfriend working night shift and the maintenance men finally got my new fridge in my new kitchen of our apartment. I had put all my food in the sink, but I had no ice to keep the food cool, so I called my sister. I was home alone and I heard a knock at the door. While telling my sister to get ice, I opened the door thinking it was one of the maintenance men. Maybe they'd left something behind that I hadn't seen yet. Nope. It was a drunk old man with a big jacket on, and it was way too hot for a big puffer jacket. Now I'm a 92-pound, 5'2" woman, and I am by myself and don't have a job, as I'm an artist who sells her work, and this situation has never happened before. "Can I use your bathroom? I don't want to piss outside," he asks while stepping closer. I say, "I'm sorry, my boyfriend's in there taking a shower," and try my best to shut the door ever so slowly. He quickly grabs the door and puts his foot between the door and the wall. I freak out, push the door with all my might, and run for my metal bat in my room. By the time I got there and was ready to hit this guy, my sister was there with her friend with the ice. I dropped to my knees and cried. She said that when they got to the steps, he was running away. I didn't call the police, but if I see him again, I will. I should have been more careful. I told my boyfriend and he said, "If no one has lived here for years and we live on the 2nd floor, why would he come to our door?" That freaked me out so badly. Hey guys, it's Mort here and thank you so much for listening. I do hope that you enjoyed tonight's stories. If you did, don't forget to drop a like and leave a comment with your thoughts. That always really helps me out. My brother has just launched a new video over on his channel, and because you're listening to this, I assume you're looking for something else to watch. Go watch his video. It's really, really good and I'm sure you'll all enjoy it. And oh look, the link is on screen right now and in the description if for whatever reason you can't click it. So I'm going to sign off. Stay awesome and I'll see you in the next one.